Good morning. In doing the research, I was able to locate 3 articles on the women's suffrage movement in the United States within the Project MUSE, Humanities and Social Science database. The first article is entitled Beneath the Suffrage Narrative by Grace Farrell. The second article is Transforming Women, Transforming Politics, the U.S. Women's Suffrage Movement by Susan M. Hartmann. And the last article is The Great Doctrine of Human Rights, Articulation and Authentication in the 19th-Century U.S. Antislavery and Women's Rights Movement by Ana Stevenson. Each article argues something different about the women's suffrage movement. However, each article also represents an important narrative concerning the movement. So the first article, Beneath the Suffrage Narrative, discusses how despite the traditional grand narrative of the suffrage movement presented by Susan B. Anthony, there were undercurrents of opposition within the movement and within the organization that made up the movement. Grace Farrell talks about how there were those within the group which emerged as the major suffrage organization early on. The National American Women's Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, which was the merger of the National Women's Suffrage Association, or the NWSA, and the American Women's Suffrage Association, or ASA. There were many who fought for women's suffrage, but were considered dissidents by the leadership of NAWSA, and were therefore marginalized, and they did not tolerate, and NAWSA really didn't tolerate independence within the organization. So those who strayed from their chosen path, NAWSA's chosen path, according to Farrell, the contribution of Lucy Stone and ASA were minimized, and its position in the 15th Amendment was distorted. The radical Matilda Jocelyn Gage was lost to history, and the amendment to the Constitution that Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote became known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So the second article, Transforming Women, Transforming Politics, the U.S. Suffrage Movement, discusses how in the past the U.S. suffrage movement hadn't been treated kindly by historians. So this is more of how the women's suffrage movement was treated historically or by historians. In fact, it says that they had actually been rather critical of the movement, arguing that women exercised as much or more influence through voluntarism and a separate political culture before the 19th Amendment as they had after its passing. The author, Susan M. Hartmann, says that it isn't until actually after the 1970s and 1980s that scholarship on women's suffrage movement begins to change. She said that while none of the new works are blind to the flaws of the movement, the new scholarship now pays particular attention to the significance of the women's suffrage movement. It sheds light on why it took so long for that to happen, for the amendment to occur. It takes the time to explain how the women accomplished it. It surveys the political conditions of the women both before and after the amendment, and it investigates the relationship between suffrage, partisan politics, and political institutions, and demonstrates how the movement shaped the political institution in ways that had never been acknowledged before. The new scholarship is also notable for stressing the, quote, tremendous obstacles that the suffrage movement had to overcome. Hartmann looks at various historians of the new scholarship and compares them to the historians of the old scholarship. In the end, she states that the new scholarship on women's suffrage, quote, not only restores the significance of suffrage to women's history, but also lays the foundation upon which more inclusive history of that movement can be written. Now, the final article that I want to talk about is the Great Doctrine of Human Rights, Articulation and Authentication in the 19th Century U.S. Anti-Slavery and Women's Rights Movement. This article discusses how the anti-slavery movement and the women's rights movement, or the women's suffrage movement, which were both social reform movements in the 19th century, were the locus for the early articulation of human rights in the United States. The author, Ana Stevenson, states that retrospectively, 19th century social movements like the women's rights movement and the anti-slavery movement and the temperance movement, and of course other movements, can collectively be viewed as emphasizing the need for protections based on human rights. While they didn't necessarily call them human rights before that time, that is what they were. The article discusses how the rhetoric of human rights emerged during the 19th century U.S. anti-slavery movement and women's rights, or later suffrage movement. Overall, the articles continue this theme that I've stuck with throughout the semester of women's suffrage. I think that the last one was a little bit of a different spin than usual, considering it discusses the movement from the perspective of human rights and how it helped to bring the term of human rights forward. Thank you, and I will see you in the next discussion.